Okay, we are going to start or continue on our series about the 12 disciples. We talked about last week the significance of the number 12, and now we are going to start with the individual disciples and some of their characteristics and history. So the first one we're going to start with is the first one that came to Jesus, which was Andrew. Andrew was the first disciple. Before Andrew was a disciple of Jesus, he was a disciple of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. And he was at the baptism of Jesus when John the Baptist baptized Jesus. So that's how he was introduced to Jesus. So if we think about John the Baptist was a man that was a very rugged man. He lived in the wilderness. He was traveling all over, preaching and teaching. And if you turned with me to John 1:35 through 41, and if you are on YouTube or Facebook, get you a piece of paper, because there's going to be some scriptures and some things you might want to write down. And we're going to be starting in John 1:35. Again, the next day after John stood, now this is John the Baptist, and two of his disciples, and looked upon Jesus as he walked, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." Now, historically, people say when he looked at him with two of his disciples, they believe that is Andrew and his brother Simon, which was Peter and Cephas. Later on, Jesus renamed him Cephas. And the two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned and saw them following, and saith unto them, "What seek ye?" They said unto him, "Rabbi." Rabbi in Jewish language just means teacher. And they said unto him, "Rabbi," which is to say, being interpreted, master. "Where dwellest thou?" He said unto them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with him there a day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first findeth his own brother Simon, and said unto him, "We have found the Messiah," which is being interpreted, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, "Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas," which is by interpretation a stone. The day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip. And he said unto him, "Follow me." Now, if you notice, Jesus never tells Andrew to follow him. It isn't in scripture anywhere. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida. Andrew was also from Bethsaida, which meant Peter was also from Bethsaida. Now, they lived in Capernaum now. So they had moved from their original place of birth to Capernaum. So there's where we are with Andrew. And when we look at Andrew, I don't know how long he had been a disciple. It doesn't say of John the Baptist, but we know he was a disciple of John the Baptist. He was Peter's brother. The relationship between the disciples and the rabbi, or the teacher, when that occurred, they lived with them, they traveled with them, they ate with them. They did everything with them, just like in the synagogue and temple. when someone was learning how to be a priest and this in the temple, you lived there, you dressed like them, you ate the same food, you strapped your sandals the same way. It was an intense, on the job experience. It wasn't, you go to school for 8 hours a day, and that's not how it was in those times. They also had to learn, when you look at the map, the Romans had kind of taken over that whole Mediterranean basin there, where what today is Italy, and they really had a lot of things going on. So it wasn't just in Jesus' area where people were saying to them, they're not happy with how the Roman takeover is going. It's in a greater thing. So they learned in an intimate way the customs, the language, the speech, everything there is to know about the rabbi or the master when they were teaching them. Now, Andrew, his name means masculine. And we know in the word that it says John the Baptist was also a manly man, very rugged. And so we know also some people interpret his name with brave. He had been in the wilderness with John the Baptist, and we know this, and he wasn't married. He didn't have a house, because later on we'll find out that it says that when he and his brother Peter had went, after they saw where Jesus had been living, they asked him to Peter's house. Andrew lived in Capernaum at Peter's house. So Andrew wasn't married, and he probably lived back in those days. A man may have his wife's mom, or, there could be a multi-generation people living there. So we know this because of what the word says. Now, also, all of this training that John the Baptist did with Andrew is important, because it taught him the basics of discipleship. He understood what it meant when he was going to be traveling with a master or a rabbi. It wasn't going to be convenient. It wasn't, you're not going to the Hilton. You were living in the desert, traveling on foot. So when he said that he was going to be a disciple of Jesus, he fully understood what that meant. I think some of the others may not have, but Andrew did. So he also was a man of honor. It doesn't say, you always hear Peter, James, and John. You always, concerning Jesus, that was his inner circle. That was how it was. But in the word, it also says several times, I think 4 to 5 times, when someone came to the group and they wanted to see this Jesus that everyone was saying was the Messiah, there was an order to it. Andrew was the one, he was the gatekeeper. In business, you have a administrative assistant, and everybody's got to go through them to get to you. Well, Andrew was Jesus' administrative assistant. So if someone wanted to come and see the Messiah, Jesus, that everyone was talking about, they went to Andrew to get an audience with him. So although the word doesn't say Andrew was in that inner circle, somehow I think he was. And he was a fisherman by trade. His brother Peter was a fisherman. And also, John and Andrew were fishermen. And when you see how it all works out, because remember when he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, Andrew was there, and he was also, when the transfiguration came, he was there. So I think Peter plays a bigger role. I think Andrew. Andrew was calm. Some of the others were a little moody, temperamental. His brother Peter was temperamental, angered quickly. He cut some guy's ear off with a sword. So apparently his brother was a little bit more meek. And Philip takes the request from Andrew about Jesus, because you've seen in that same scripture that we were just there, it talks about Jesus asked Philip, "Follow me," but he never asked Andrew or Peter, "Follow him." So I think it was just understood there. I think Andrew and Peter were probably disciples, both of them, of John the Baptist. And I think they understood what was happening. And we talked about when Jesus does something, he does it in order. It's not chaotic. There's a process. And so it makes perfect sense that when people would come to the group to see Jesus or have a visit with Jesus, that he would have appointed someone to take care of that. I'm sure every task that needed to be done, he appointed people to do those tasks. Now, when in these days, there weren't many people that were literate. Even when the Hebrew children were learning the Torah, many times, first they would learn the Hebrew alphabet, and then they would start with the Torah. Most of it was memorization. They may not have known what the words meant, but most of it was memorization. And that was how education was. There wasn't public education. It wasn't formed. It wasn't like that. You went and you learned these Hebrew alphabet, and then you would memorize the Torah. Because remember, we talked about last week about the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah. Well, they're preparing for that because they are going to read in the temple aloud when this occurs, between 12 and 13. So there's also, if you are a priest, Pharisee, anyone like that, there's a process of education that you go through. The first one is called a bat sephar, B-E-T, but pronounced bat, S-E-F-E-R, pronounced sefer. Now, this means the house of the book, written in the Torah. It's also where little boys would go between the ages of 6 and 10 years old. Now, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're not going to go there just because I've got so much to cover. And it's also in the book of Numbers, chapter 15. It talks about this. And it's also in the creation story in Genesis. So this is where they would go, and this is their first step. They would learn how to do these things. They were little Jewish boys, and if they were, their whole goal was so they could read the Torah aloud before their bar mitzvah. That's what the whole goal was. They may never see or write or read it again. Now, if you were a poor kid from somewhere around there, it stopped right there. That's all the education you got. You went back home, and whatever your father did, if he was a farmer, fisherman, carpenter, you went to work with him every day, and you learned his trade because you were going to take over the family business. If you weren't, if you were going to go on, you wanted to go into anything else, there is a Beit Talmud, Talmud. Now, the other was you see the written word, and that's all. You learn how to pronounce your alphabet. This is oral. So you're going to read aloud and learn all there is to learn. If you're going to go into the priesthood, you're going to be a teacher, whatever. But most people didn't do this. These were for other people. There is one disciple that did this, and that would be Matthew. Matthew was the only literate disciple there was. And the reason Matthew is because he was from a wealthier family, and he had to know either 4 or 5 languages because he had to keep records in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and let me think for a minute. There's another one. I'll think of it. So he had to be able to read and write those languages, not just speak them. So for him, that's also another reason why the other 11 may not have liked him, because he was kind of in a better class than they. But that just shows, even as despised as he was, Jesus' redemptive power is still present. His redemptive power. It doesn't matter if you did work for the Roman government and collect taxes. He can still speak into your life. It also speaks to Matthew's, the tax collectors back then were known for cheating. Also, Rome said they owe this amount. You collect that amount, you send that to Rome, and whatever else you get, it goes in your account. So Matthew was wealthy, but he left all that to follow Jesus. So he had some kind of transformative experience, because people, money is a big tie a lot of times to people, and it can be their God. So he did allow and have an experience with Jesus that meant more to him than his bankroll. So that's one good thing. Now, some of these students that they had, maybe you sent one of the children to learn, and if, you had a big farm or a business where you couldn't send all the children, that child would come back and teach the others. So now the third phase of the education, this is definitely going to be for your priest, your higher ups, people in government, those kind of folks. It's called Beit Midrash, and that's the way it's pronounced, but it's spelled B-E-T, new word M-I-D-R-A-S-H. R-A-S-H. Now at this time, and if we talked about last week, Jesus was at the feet of priests and learned men in the temple when his parents realized, after they had been there for Passover in Jerusalem, they left, and it was like a day and a half, they realized Jesus isn't there. They go through the whole group. No, Jesus not there. He's not with Granny. He's not with Auntie. So they turn around and they go back and they find him at the temple. And his mother questions him. You know, we've traveled a day and we couldn't find you. And Jesus, you know, I'm paraphrasing, says, don't you know I have to be about my Father's business? So in this third phase of the education, these folks are actually doing exactly what Jesus did. They're at the feet of these priests and learned people, and they are learning how things work in that role. And sometimes this will be shared from generation to generation to generation. Most of the people that are in this third, they're pretty wealthy, because you couldn't really, you know, afford for your children to be away from your farm or your business. That those were your workers. So, and they, just like when they are following John the Baptist and Jesus, they lived with the rabbis and priests. They learned how they spoke. They learned how they wrote. They learned what they eat. They also learned what they did not do. So, you know, the practical application of something, well, at least for me, is the best way to learn. Seeing it up close, live, in person. So we talked a little bit about Andrew and Andrew meeting the people that wanted to see Jesus, wanted an audience with Jesus. Now, if you look in John 1, Andrew introduces Jesus to Peter. Simon, he's not Peter yet, but as soon as he gets introduced, Jesus says who he was. He even knew that he was the son of Jonah. He says that to him. But now, your name is going to be called Cephas. And that's one time. Then in the second time, John 6, Andrew introduces Jesus to a small boy. You know, this little boy's trying to get to see Jesus. And I can imagine there's a whole group of men around him who want to meet him too. But he did allow him to meet Jesus. The third time Andrew, it's in the word, Andrew introduces Jesus. He introduces in John 12, he introduces Jesus to foreigners and dignitaries. So I'm sure Andrew was the one introducing Jesus. If he did it in the word 3 times, that was pretty much his role. Plus, Andrew, I think he was one of the most calm of the disciples, from what I've been reading about. Even though he was one of the biggest in size, and the most masculine, I don't know, you know, but there you go. He and Peter were fishermen, and that's how they made their living. But now they're going with Jesus. And I'm sure that was a big decision because Peter, Cephas now, he has to leave his wife, his business, and travel with Jesus. So these people weren't just, they weren't just single guys, nomads. There were things that were going on that probably gave them trepidation. So they were all in as far as being disciples, because you don't leave, the military has limits, and a lot of other organization has limits, because that's sometimes all people can tolerate. Now, some people, that's what they want to do. They want to make that a career. But, in the end, when we talk about and we see Andrew, he goes to Greece and they try to have him denounce Christianity there. And he won't. He says, no, he can't. He's not going to do that. And they end up executing him. And this is the disciple that was crucified on the X. It wasn't even a cross, it was an X. And, it's tragic, but all but one ended up with a very tragic end of life. But they did it. They believed in Jesus and Christianity. And they didn't like how the Romans were behaving, but that didn't matter to them. They knew this Jesus, this Messiah that had been prophesied in the Old Testament for years and years. They've talked about the Messiah coming. And when Jesus came, there are a few churches that are called the Way. And that came from Jesus. When he came in Jesus' ministry, initially, when he was out with the disciples, the movement was called the Way. And it was the way to Christianity. It was the way to heaven. It was the way. And then, they changed it to Christianity, Christ followers, but that's what it was called. And this movement, people didn't understand it. The Pharisees and the rabbis, they just didn't understand fully what that meant for the Jewish people and what it meant because a lot of people were pagans in the area. I mean, they weren't Jewish people. They basically were pagans. They worshiped gods of this and that and something else. So it was a big deal. And they were persecuted. This was not received with open arms. It wasn't like Baptist and Pentecostal crossover. No, it wasn't like that at all. So they were not treated well in many aspects. So when you see a picture of Jesus and his disciples and they're all clean and their robes are clean, that's not how it was. Because they were living, basically, it was a missionary on foot. So they were walking down the same roads that the donkeys and camels and horses and everybody else was using the bathroom in. They had sandals. Their robes may have been dragging the ground. There wasn't fresh running water. It wasn't at all. It was a sacrifice for Jesus and for them. So think about that when the next time you think about, because in Sunday school, we learned that colored little pictures of them and they were all nice and neat and clean shaven, big white teeth. No, that's not how it was. It was very hard on them and it was very hard for them, but they did it because the Holy Spirit had moved in. When they got saved and they accept Christ into their heart, they had a transformation. Now, the disciples, there are a few of them that their lineage can be tracked to the tribes, the 12 tribes. 10 of Jacob's sons and 2 of his grandsons. That's who makes up the head of the 12 tribes. But by this time, they really didn't track that. In the Old Testament, they were tracking that for one reason, so that they could prove that Jesus came out of the lineage of Abraham and David. And that was the only real reason that they were tracked. So now we're in the New Testament, and as far as I know, there's only one that is tracked in the tribe, and we're going to talk about him now. He's Matthew, and Matthew is educated. He's of the tribe of Levi. Actually, Matthew's name was Levi. Jesus, again, changed his name to Matthew. And Jesus just changed his folks' name when he saw fit. But every time he changed a name, there was a meaning, there was a reason. And the meanings of the name was significant. Like I said, he was the only one that was literate. He could read, write, do math, and he could read, write in 5 languages. He was a tax collector. He had to keep records. He lived in the Roman Empire, where the official name was Latin. But he was Jewish, okay? Obviously, if he's from the tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi is the tribe where all the priests came from. When we talked about the tribes, and when Moses was leading the folks out of Egypt on the great Exodus, we talked about when Moses went up to the mountain, God told him how to build the tabernacle, how to build the Ark of the Covenant. He also told him in what configuration the 12 tribes should be during this pilgrimage, during the Exodus. The tribe of Levi was the ones that was always close, right up next to the Ark of the Covenant. Always, because they were the keepers of the Ark of the Covenant, the Levites, the priests. So it's significant. Now he could speak, here's this other one. He could speak Hebrew, he could speak Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and one more. I'll think of it. Now, in Matthew's gospel, he wrote it in Greek when he penned it. However, he transcribed that into the Hebrew language because it was written in Greek and Aramaic originally, and he transcribed it so that his people, the Jewish people, could read it. Now, it is the oldest gospel of the 4 gospels. The disciples, they were learning from Jesus the entire time they were with him. Even though they were only with him for 3.5 years with Jesus' ministry, it was 24/7. They did what he did. They ate what he ate. They dressed like him. They did everything because that was the way of the times, especially if you were learning from a rabbi, a master, of that. Now, Matthew, although he was Jewish, he was to go all over the areas that Rome had taken over. So that Mediterranean Sea basin there, he was well traveled, and he had to speak their language. So when he came upon, and one more thing, there was 3 kinds of tax that they had. They had a tax on grain, which was a tenth of the harvest. That was one of the taxes. The other taxes were 1/5 of the fruit that was harvested. And then there was a poll tax. That's a flat tax that every human being paid, regardless. Didn't matter where you lived, what you did, you paid that. And then you paid a 1% income tax. So minus the poll tax, which everyone paid, there was 3 income taxes and then the poll tax. So the governments, how they decided who would be the person collecting the taxes is the government would choose somebody, and it would be someone usually of a little bit higher class, and they would get them from the area in which they were from. So they knew the rich people, the medium people, the poor people, and they did this so that the appropriate tax would be collected. You know, if you're a millionaire, you can't say, oh, I only have $500,000, because he's walked by your mansion every day. He knows exactly what you got, how many servants. So, this was new, because in before, we talked about last week, the Jewish people were used to tithe 1/10. Then when Rome started taking over, you have to pay that, and then you have to pay all this other stuff. So they were not popular, but nonetheless, they still had to do it. So they knew what the local economy was, what was going on, if there was a famine in a certain area and people actually couldn't harvest grain or fruit, well, if you harvest nothing, then the tax is nothing. So it was important at that time. Now, most tax collectors, and I'm sure before Matthew came along Jesus' path, he was like this too. They weren't the most honest fellows, because remember, they collect whatever Rome tells them. They send that money to Rome, and whatever's left, whether they've overcharged somebody, it's their salary, they keep. So they were known kind of to be scallywags, not so good people. But when Jesus came across Matthew's tax booth, and he had the experience with Jesus, he decides to give all that up and follow Jesus. And I would imagine when the Holy Spirit's and Jesus, they kind of need a Matthew. All these other guys are fishermen, farmers, but Matthew was kind of a businessman. He was a little more savvy, a little more polished, a lot more wealthy. And he could read and write, which is important. He's the one that first penned the Gospel of Matthew. Some say the others that wrote Bible books, one of their disciples is the one that penned it, them speaking to them. I don't know if that's 100% true. It doesn't say that in the Word, but that's what historians say. So if it's not in the Word, it just may be a maybe. Because we only take what we see and know is in this. Now, when Herod, Herod is the one that built all these grand buildings, and really the Roman Empire was, he's the one that had these grandiose ideas that Rome was going to rule the world and they were going to have all these things. Well, he left when he died. He divided his wealth and his lineage, different parts of what he had deemed Rome's. Well, his son, named Antipas, Antipas, he got the minor portion, which mainly was the principalities of Galilee, northern Palestine, east of the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. And then he also had Derea. And he ruled the area that Jesus was in all through Jesus' ministry. So Herod the king passed away, and his son Antipas took over ruling that area. And I think he might have been, Herod was pretty tough, but I think his son might have been a little more lean and allow things that his father would not. Now, we talked about Andrew. Even though Andrew was the most masculine and the larger sized disciple, he was the one that was kind of most docile. He was the calmer one. But the rest were not. And just like in a church body, the body of the 12, there were little scuff ups here and there. Everybody doesn't see, I want to go to the Sea of Galilee. No, I want to go over here to this lake and fish. No, it was like that. But Peter, I don't know if Jesus deemed him the leader or just they deemed him the leader. He was kind of the leader of the 12. And sometimes, they kind of had to go their separate ways a few times just for people to, be able to go with the program. Now, Matthew's name means gift of God. So his name was changed from Levi to Matthew, meaning the gift from God. And Matthew's story tells us the main goal of Matthew's story is of God's redemptive power. There is no one that is beyond redemption by Jesus. No one. Not one person. So if you look at his name and you break down the name Matthew, he's inserted Yahweh into his name. So Jesus thought enough to insert Yahweh into Matthew's name. We'll pick up here next week. We're not half done with Matthew. So we'll do the rest of Matthew, and then we'll get to the next disciple. Thank you for listening. God bless you and have a great week. Thank you.